There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room right before someone thinks they have won. I know that silence well now. I felt it wrap around me the morning I sat at the long oak table in the lawyer's office, 11 days after I buried my wife, watching my daughter-in-law cross her legs and smile like a cat who had finally trapped the bird. Vanessa wore a deep wine-coloured dress that she must have bought for the occasion, because she certainly had not worn it to Margaret's funeral. At the funeral she wore grey and dabbed at dry eyes with a folded tissue. Today there were no tissues. Today her lipstick was perfect, her nails were freshly done, and she sat with her spine straight and her chin tilted up, already counting in her head what she believed was about to fall into her lap. My son Daniel sat beside her, with his hands folded in his lap, and his eyes fixed on the grain of the table. He was 41 years old, and he could not look his own father in the face. He had spent the morning agreeing with everything his wife said, nodding along like a man being walked towards something he was afraid to name. The lawyer, Arthur Quinn, shuffled a thin stack of papers and cleared his throat. Vanessa leaned forward, and I saw it happen. I saw the smile spread across her face, slow and certain, the smile of someone who has already spent the money. She thought she was about to inherit everything Margaret and I had spent 44 years building. She thought a tired, grieving old man with shaking hands and a heart full of grief was the easiest target she would ever meet in her life. She had forgotten something. She had forgotten that Margaret saw her coming a long time ago, and she had forgotten that the quietest person in any room is usually the one who already knows how it ends. Before I tell you what Arthur Quinn pulled out of that folder, and before I tell you exactly how the smile slid off Vanessa's face, 1 inch at a time, do me a favour. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because I read every single one of them. And if you have ever had to sit across from someone who underestimated you, someone who treated your patience like weakness, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay with me because this story is going to be worth your time. To understand how we ended up around that table, you have to go back with me to the beginning. You have to understand who Margaret was and what we built and why a woman like Vanessa thought she could take it without a fight. My name is Walter Cole, and I am 69 years old. For the last 44 of those years, I was married to a woman named Margaret, and I will tell you plainly that I never deserved her. I was a quiet man who drove a delivery route when we met. She was the one with the vision. She was the one with the fire. We bought a failing apple orchard outside a small valley town in the autumn of 1981. 60 acres of crooked trees, a leaking barn, and a farmhouse with a roof that let the rain in. The previous owner sold it to us for almost nothing because he had given up on it, and most people in town thought we were fools for taking it. Margaret looked at those crooked trees and saw something nobody else could see. She always did. We had $200 in a coffee can and a baby on the way. I remember the first winter we lived in that drafty farmhouse with a single wood stove, wearing our coats indoors and laughing about it because we were too young and too stubborn to be afraid. Margaret kept the books at the kitchen table by lamplight, while I learned how to prune a tree the right way from an old man down the road who took pity on us. We named the place Hollow Creek Orchards. For the first 10 years, we barely scraped by. We sold apples at a roadside stand, then to a few local grocers, then to bakeries 2 towns over. Margaret was the one who decided we should stop selling cheap fruit to middlemen and start pressing our own cider. She drew up the whole plan on the back of a feed store receipt. She found us a small loan when 3 banks had already told us no. She stood in front of a loan officer who clearly thought she was wasting his time, and she walked out with the money. By the time our son Daniel was grown, Hollow Creek Orchards was no longer a struggling little farm. We had 200 acres. We had a cidery that shipped to 12 states. We had a tasting room and a cafe that brought in tourists every weekend in the fall. We employed almost 60 people from the valley. Good people, people whose parents had thought we were fools back in 1981. The whole thing was worth somewhere north of $12 million by the time Margaret got sick. But the number was never the point. The point was the 44 years of cold mornings and late nights. The point was every tree we planted with our own hands. The point was Margaret laughing in the cab of our old truck with frost on the windshield. You cannot put a price on that. People like Vanessa never understand that, which is exactly why people like Vanessa always lose in the end, even when they think they are winning. Margaret got sick the way strong people often do, slowly and then all at once. Her heart had been weak for a few years, and the doctors managed it with pills and warnings and appointments she hated keeping. Then one spring, her body simply began to give out. She spent her last 8 months at home in the bed we had shared for decades, looking out the window at the orchard she had built from nothing. I sat with her every day. I read to her. I held her hand. I learned how to braid her hair when her arms got too tired to lift. And in those last months, I watched her do something I did not fully understand at the time. I watched her make phone calls she did not explain. I watched her ask me to bring her certain folders from the office. I watched her have long, quiet conversations with Arthur Quinn, the lawyer who had handled our affairs for 30 years. I thought she was simply putting things in order, the way careful people do. I did not realise that Margaret, even from her sickbed, even with her heart failing, was building one last thing. She was building a trap. And she was building it for the woman who had been circling our family like a hawk for years. Vanessa married into our family 8 years ago. I will be honest with you, I had my doubts from the start, but a father learns to keep those doubts to himself. Daniel was 33 when he met her, and he came home from a business conference glowing like a boy who had won a prize. She was beautiful, polished, and quick with a compliment, and within 6 months they were married at a venue that cost more than my first truck. At first she played her part well. She brought flowers when she visited. She called Margaret by sweet names. She asked thoughtful questions about the orchard, took an interest in the business, complimented the cider, complimented the house, complimented everything. Margaret, who could read a person faster than anyone I ever met, smiled politely and watched. It took me longer to see it than it took my wife. Margaret told me once, only once, early on, that Vanessa never looked at Daniel the way a woman looks at a man she loves. She looked at him the way a person looks at a door they intend to walk through. The interest in the business was never really interest. It was inventory. Over the years, Vanessa learned exactly what we owned, what it was worth, how the company was structured, who the lawyer was, where the money sat. She asked her questions sweetly, and she filed away every answer. And as the years went on, the sweetness wore thinner. She started correcting Margaret in front of guests. She started making little comments about how an orchard was an old-fashioned business, how the smart money was in selling the land to developers, how Daniel deserved a better life than waiting around for his parents to step aside. Daniel, my son, my only child, let it happen. That is the part that still sits heavy in my chest. He was not a cruel boy. He was a soft one. He had grown up comfortable because Margaret and I made sure of it, and somewhere along the way, comfort had hollowed out his backbone. By the time he married Vanessa, he had stopped being able to decide what he wanted for breakfast without checking her face first. She did not raise her voice at him. She did not need to. She simply made it clear, in 100 small ways, that disagreeing with her was more trouble than it was worth. So when Vanessa decided she wanted Hollow Creek orchards, Daniel did not fight her. He went along, the way he always did. He told himself it was for the family. He told himself his father was old and tired and would be better off resting. He told himself a great many comfortable lies, and his wife was happy to supply every one of them. What neither of them knew was that Margaret had spent the last 6 months of her life making absolutely certain that wanting it and getting it were two very different things. Margaret passed away on a Tuesday morning in the spring, with the apple blossoms just beginning to open outside the window. I was holding her hand. She squeezed it once, very gently, and then she was gone. And the house went quiet in a way it had never been quiet in 44 years. I will not pretend I held together well. For the first few days I moved through the world like a man underwater. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and handshakes, and people I half recognised telling me how sorry they were. The whole valley turned out for her. The orchard workers came in their good clothes, and the foreman, a big quiet man named Earl Dawson, who had worked our land for 25 years, wept openly at the back of the church and did not care who saw. Vanessa and Daniel sat in the front pew with me. Daniel cried. Vanessa did not. I noticed, in the small detached way you notice things when you are numb, that Vanessa spent most of the service on her phone, held low against her thigh, her thumb moving across the screen. I did not have the energy to be angry about it that day. I would have plenty of energy later. The casseroles had not even been finished before she made her move. 3 days after the funeral, Vanessa and Daniel came to the farmhouse. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. I had let go cold, looking at the chair where Margaret used to sit. Vanessa walked in without knocking, set a leather folder on the table in front of me, and pulled out the chair, Margaret's chair. She sat in my wife's chair 3 days after I buried her, and she smiled at me like she was doing me a kindness. "Walter," she said, in the soft, careful voice people use on children and the elderly. We need to talk about the future. I looked at the folder. I looked at her, I said nothing. You have had a terrible loss, she went on. We all have. But the orchard does not stop needing decisions just because we are grieving. There are payroll deadlines, there are supplier contracts, there are things that have to be handled by someone with a clear head. She folded her hands. We think it would be best if you stepped back. Let Daniel and me take over the operations. You can stay in the house, of course. You can rest. You have earned it. Daniel stood behind her with his hand on the back of her chair, nodding along, looking everywhere but at me. I picked up the folder and opened it. Inside was a document titled Voluntary Transfer of Management and Controlling Interest. It was thorough. Somebody had clearly been working on it for a while. It would have handed Vanessa and Daniel full control of Hollow Creek Orchards, the cidery, the land, and the accounts. There was a gold pen lying next to it, already uncapped, ready for my signature. I have run a business for 44 years. I know what a hostile takeover looks like, even when it is dressed up as compassion. I knew looking at that document that this was not something a grieving daughter-in-law put together in 3 days. This had been drafted before Margaret was even cold. I kept my voice level. In a negotiation, the first person to get emotional has already lost. Margaret taught me that, sitting at this same table, decades ago. This is a lot to look at, I said. I will need some time to read it properly. Vanessa's smile tightened just slightly at the corners. Of course, she said. But Walter, time is exactly what the business does not have. The longer the leadership is unclear, the more nervous the suppliers get. We really should get this signed this week. I will read it this week, I said. I am not signing anything I have not read. She did not like that. I watched her decide whether to push harder, and I watched her decide against it. She stood up, smoothed her wine-coloured dress, the same dress I would see again at the lawyer's office, and she gave me a small nod. Take your time, she said, in a tone that meant exactly the opposite. But not too much. They left. And as they walked down the hall to the front door, I stayed very still and watched their reflection in the dark glass of the china cabinet. Margaret had loved that cabinet. It had belonged to her mother. And in its reflection, I watched Vanessa stop at the door, pull out her phone and type something quickly with a satisfied little smile. Then she showed the screen to Daniel, and Daniel laughed. A short, nervous, ugly little laugh. They had no idea I could see them. They thought the old man was alone in the kitchen, beaten and confused, fumbling through a document he did not understand. That was the moment the fog lifted. That was the moment the grief in my chest turned into something colder and clearer. I sat at Margaret's table, and I thought about my wife, and I thought about the phone call she had made in her last month that she never explained, and I picked up the phone and called Arthur Quinn. Walter, he said when he heard my voice, and there was something in his tone, something that told me he had been expecting this call. I'm glad you reached out. Margaret left some things with me. She asked me to wait until you were ready. He paused. Are you ready? I looked at the leather folder on the table, at the gold pen waiting for my signature. Arthur, I said, I think I am about to be. The next morning I drove into town and sat in Arthur Quinn's office, the same office where Margaret and I had signed our first business loan 30 years ago. Arthur was a small, precise man in his late 60s, with reading glasses he wore on a chain and a memory like a steel trap. He had handled our affairs for 3 decades, and he had loved Margaret almost as much as I did, in the way that loyal old friends do. He poured me a cup of coffee, sat down across from me, and laid a thick sealed envelope on the desk. My name was written across the front in Margaret's handwriting. Just seeing those letters, that familiar loop of her capital W, put a lump in my throat that I had to swallow hard to get past. She wrote this about 4 months ago, Arthur said gently, when she still had the strength to write. She made me promise not to give it to you until after she was gone, and not until you came to me on your own. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly, Walter, she said, he'll come to you when he's ready. He's slower than me, but he gets there. I laughed, and the laugh cracked in the middle. That was Margaret. That was her voice, reaching me from the other side of a sealed envelope. I opened it carefully and unfolded the pages. I will not read you the whole letter, because some of it belonged only to me, and some things a man keeps for himself. But I will tell you what it said, in the parts that matter. Margaret wrote that she had known for a long time, Exactly what Vanessa was. She wrote that she had watched her catalogue our possessions for years, watched her wear Daniel down, watched her wait. She wrote that she was not afraid for herself because she was dying, but that she was afraid for me because she knew I was kinder than I was suspicious, and she knew that Vanessa would come for me the moment she was gone. So Margaret had done something about it. She wrote that in her last healthy year, before her heart failed in earnest, she had quietly begun moving the structure of everything we owned. She had not told me, she said, because she did not want me to carry the weight of it while she was still alive, and because she admitted with a little joke, even on paper, I was a terrible liar and Vanessa would have seen it on my face. She wanted my grief to be real and unguarded, because a real grieving widower is the most disarming thing in the world to a predator. She wanted Vanessa to walk into the trap, fully confident. And there was one more thing in the letter, the thing that made my hands go still on the page. Margaret wrote that in the process of restructuring the company's finances, she and Arthur had hired a forensic accountant to do a quiet review of the books, a woman named Lena Park. And what Lena Park found, Margaret wrote, was that for the past 2 years, money had been disappearing from Hollow Creek orchards, small amounts at first, then larger ones, vendor payments to companies that did not exist, consulting fees to a financial advisor named Trent Walsh, a man none of us had ever met, billed at numbers that made no sense. The money had been flowing out of our company accounts and into accounts controlled by Vanessa. She had been stealing from us for 2 years, slowly, carefully, the way she did everything. And there were documents, Margaret wrote, transfer authorizations and approval forms that bore my signature. I had not signed any of them. Vanessa had forged my name to steal from the company my wife built. And Margaret, lying in her sickbed with her heart giving out, had found every last thread of it and pulled it tight. I set the letter down on Arthur's desk, and for a long moment I could not speak. Arthur sat quietly and let me have the silence. Outside the window, the morning traffic of the little town went by, ordinary and oblivious. "There's more," Arthur finally said. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a flash drive and a thick-bound report. Lena Park's full findings. Every transaction, every forged document, every dollar traced. Margaret had it all compiled. And there's this. He held up the flash drive. She recorded a message for the reading of the estate. She wanted it played when the family was all together. "When is the reading?" I asked. "Whenever you say. The will and the trust are ready. Everything Margaret set up is ironclad. But, Walter..." He took off his glasses and looked at me directly. "Vanessa is going to push for a reading fast. She thinks she's about to inherit. The longer you wait, the more impatient and reckless she'll get. My advice, as your lawyer, and as Margaret's friend." A thin smile crossed his face. Let her be impatient. Let her schedule the meeting herself. Let her walk in expecting to win. I picked up the gold pen on Arthur's desk, the one for signing real documents. I thought about Margaret laughing in the cab of our old truck. I thought about her at the kitchen table by lamplight, balancing books that did not balance, refusing to give up. "Arthur," I said, "set the meeting, and do not breathe a word about what we have. When Vanessa walks into that room, I want her smiling." I went home and I played the part Margaret had written for me, and I will tell you, it was the hardest acting I have ever done in my life. Over the next week, I let Vanessa believe she was winning. When she called to push about the transfer document, I let my voice waver. I told her I was overwhelmed, that I did not understand all the legal language, that I was so tired. I let her hear an old man cracking under the weight of grief. She ate it up. Her tone got warmer the weaker I sounded, the way a hawk circles lower when the rabbit stops running. She came by the house twice more that week, each time she sat in Margaret's chair, each time she brought up the transfer, and each time I deflected, just enough to keep her wanting it, never enough to make her suspicious. I told her I wanted to wait until after the formal reading of the estate, so everything could be done properly and legally. I told her I did not want any of it to be contested later. That was the bait, and she took it whole. The idea of a formal reading delighted her, because in her mind the reading was simply the moment the prize was officially handed over. She believed Margaret had left everything to Daniel, with herself as the real power behind him, the way it had always worked in our family. She did not know that Margaret had spent her dying months making sure the reading would be the exact opposite of a coronation. Vanessa took over the planning of the meeting with the eagerness of someone arranging her own victory party. She called Arthur Quinn's office herself to set the date. She picked the day. She picked the time. She told Daniel what to wear. She arranged for her financial advisor, Trent Walsh, to be available by phone in case any paperwork needed handling on the spot because, of course, she wanted her own man ready to take control of the accounts the moment the estate transferred. She had no idea she was inviting the second name on the forensic report into the room with her. The night before the meeting, I sat alone in the farmhouse. I walked through the rooms Margaret and I had filled with a lifetime. I stood in the orchard for a while as the sun went down, looking at the trees we had planted, the trees that had outlasted every hard winter, every drought, every bank that ever told us no. I thought about the woman who built this place beside me, who even as she was dying, had reached forward in time to protect everything we made. I thought about how the world looks at a quiet old man and sees a victim, when sometimes a quiet old man is just someone who has already decided how the story ends and is patient enough to wait. I slept well that night, better than I had since the funeral. In the morning I put on my good suit, the grey one Margaret always said made me look distinguished, and I drove into town. Arthur Quinn's conference room had a long oak table and tall windows that let in the spring light. When I arrived, Vanessa and Daniel were already there sitting on one side, and I saw immediately that they had taken the power seats, the ones nearest the head of the table. As if the room already belonged to them, Vanessa wore the wine-coloured dress. Her hair was done. Her smile was ready. She rose to greet me with a performance of warmth, took both my hands in hers, told me how proud Margaret would have been to see the family handling things with such grace. Daniel stood and shook my hand limply, his eyes sliding off to the side. He looked like a man who had not slept. Some small part of him, I think, knew something was wrong. He just did not have the spine to ask what. I let Vanessa seat me. I let her fuss over me. I played the tired old man right up until the moment Arthur Quinn walked in. Arthur sat at the head of the table with a thin folder and a laptop. He set them down, folded his hands, and looked around the room with the unreadable calm of a man who has done this 1,000 times. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We're here today for the formal reading and execution of the estate of Margaret Ann Cole. Before we begin, I want to note that everything we discuss today is recorded and witnessed, as is standard." He gestured to a small device on the table. Margaret was very specific about how she wanted this handled. Vanessa nodded along graciously, settling back in her chair. She crossed her legs, and there it was. The smile. The slow, certain, victorious smile of a woman who believes the hard part is over and the spending is about to begin. "Margaret left a personal message," Arthur said, "to be played at the start of this meeting. She asked that everyone watch it before any documents are reviewed." He turned the laptop to face the table and pressed a key. The screen flickered, and then there was my wife. I had not seen her face in motion since the morning she died, and the sight of her went through me like a current. The video had been recorded in our bedroom, in the chair by the window, with the orchard visible behind her. She was thin and pale, but her eyes were sharp, sharper than they had any right to be, and her voice when she spoke was steady. "Hello, everyone," Margaret said from the screen. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and you're all sitting in Arthur's conference room. I imagine some of you are more comfortable than others right now." Daniel went very still. Vanessa's smile held, but it had stopped reaching her eyes. "Walter," Margaret said, and she looked directly into the camera, directly at me across the distance of death. "I love you. You built this with me, every tree of it, and I know you're sitting there pretending to be more tired than you are, because I asked you to. Thank you for trusting me one last time." I felt my throat close. Vanessa's head turned slowly toward me. "Daniel," Margaret continued, and her voice softened with sadness. "You were a sweet boy. I don't know exactly when you stopped being your own man, but I watched it happen, and it broke my heart. I hope someday you find your way back. But hope isn't a plan, and a mother's love isn't a license to be foolish." Then Margaret's expression changed. The softness left it, and what remained was the steel that had walked into a bank and walked out with a loan when 3 banks had said no. "Vanessa," she said. The room went absolutely silent. "I knew what you were the first time you sat at my table," Margaret said. "I watched you count my silverware with your eyes. I watched you measure my son and find him useful. I watched you wait. You thought I was just a sick old woman who couldn't see past her own dying. A small, cold smile crossed my wife's face on the screen. You should have paid more attention to how I built all of this in the first place. I see everything, Vanessa. I always did, and I spent the last good months of my life making very sure that you would never get a single acre of what Walter and I made. Vanessa's mouth had fallen open slightly. The wine-coloured dress no longer looked triumphant. It looked like a costume for a party that had been cancelled. Arthur will explain the rest, Margaret said. Walter, my love, finish it for me. You know how. You always knew how. You just let me do the talking. Her face gentled one last time. I'll be in the orchard. I'll always be in the orchard. Goodbye, my darling. The screen went black. For a moment nobody moved. The spring light came through the tall windows. Somewhere in the building a phone rang and went unanswered. And then Vanessa, recovering faster than I expected, let out a brittle laugh. Well, she said, that was very emotional. Margaret was always dramatic, but sentiment isn't a legal document. Arthur, perhaps we should get to the actual reading of the will. I'm sure there's a great deal to transfer. Arthur Quinn looked at her over the top of his reading glasses, and I almost felt sorry for her, watching her walk so eagerly toward the cliff. There is a great deal, Arthur said mildly. But none of it transfers the way you're imagining, Mrs. Cole. Arthur opened his folder. Margaret Cole didn't leave her estate as a simple will, he began. Approximately 14 months ago, she restructured the entirety of Hollow Creek Orchards, the cidery, the land, the accounts, and all associated holdings into an irrevocable trust. The sole trustee of that trust, with full and exclusive control over all assets, is her husband Walter Cole. Vanessa's smile was gone now, completely gone. There is no controlling interest to transfer to anyone, Arthur continued. There was nothing for Margaret to leave, in the conventional sense, because as of 14 months ago, she no longer personally owned any of it. The trust does, and the trust is Walter's, free and clear, with no obligation to distribute any portion of it to any party. Not to Daniel, not to you. Daniel made a small sound, like the air going out of something. That can't be right, Vanessa said, and her voice had climbed half an octave. Daniel is her son. He's her only child. He's entitled to an inheritance. We'll contest it. We'll show the court that an elderly woman was manipulated into signing away her own estate while she was ill and not in her right mind. I spoke for the first time since the video ended. Margaret restructured everything before she was bedridden, Vanessa. 14 months ago she was sharp as a blade and running the business herself. Arthur has her medical records, sworn physician statements, and 3 witnesses to every signature. I kept my voice perfectly calm, the way she had once kept hers when she sat in my dead wife's chair. There is no court in this country that will call Margaret Cole incompetent. You did not know her. I did. The woman never signed anything she did not understand in her life. Vanessa's eyes darted around the room, looking for a foothold, finding none. Beside her, Daniel had put his face in his hands. And then I nodded to Arthur, and Arthur reached back into his folder and laid the second document on the table. There is one more matter, Arthur said, that Margaret asked me to address. He slid the bound report across the table so it stopped directly in front of Vanessa. This is a forensic accounting review of Hollow Creek Orchard's financial records over the past 2 years, Arthur said, conducted by Lena Park, a certified forensic accountant, commissioned by Margaret 11 months ago. He let that sit a moment. It documents the systematic diversion of company funds, payments to fictitious vendors, consulting fees to a financial advisor named Trent Walsh, who, Ms. Park determined, is your cousin, Mrs. Cole. Funds routed through 3 intermediary accounts and ultimately deposited into accounts in your name. The total, over 2 years, comes to approximately $410,000. The colour drained out of Vanessa's face so fast I thought she might faint. And these, Arthur said, sliding a smaller stack of papers across, are the transfer authorizations used to move those funds. Each of them bears the signature of Walter Cole, authorizing the payments. He paused. Walter, I'll ask you formally, for the record, did you sign any of these documents? I have never seen any of them before in my life, I said. And I did not authorize a single one of those payments. Somebody forged my name. A forensic document examiner has confirmed, Arthur said quietly, that the signatures on these forms are forgeries. The metadata on the digital approvals traces to a laptop registered to you, Mrs. Cole. Lena Park's full chain of evidence is in the report. It is, in my professional opinion, an airtight case for embezzlement, forgery, and wire fraud. The room was so quiet I could hear Daniel's ragged breathing. Vanessa was not smiling anymore. She was not even sitting up straight. She had shrunk into the chair, the wine-coloured dress pooling around her like spilled liquid, and for the first time since I had known her, she had nothing to say. The polished words, the sweet, careful voice. All of it had abandoned her at once. Then Daniel lifted his head and he looked at his wife. And I watched something break open in my son's face. "Trent," he said hoarsely. "You told me Trent was a consultant. You told me those were real fees. I signed off on the budgets, Vanessa. You had me sign off on the budgets." His voice cracked. "You used my company access. You used my father's name. You made me part of this." "Daniel," she snapped, her composure splintering. "Shut up!" But the spell was finally broken. 8 years of it, broken in a single moment in a conference room. Daniel turned to me, and there were tears running down his face. And he looked, for the first time in a very long time, like my son again, and not like a man waiting for permission to breathe. "Dad," he whispered. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know how much." I looked at him for a long moment. I will tell you honestly that part of me wanted to forgive him. Right there. He was my boy. I had taught him to ride a bicycle in the orchard rows, but I had also watched him sit in my kitchen 3 days after I buried his mother and nod along while his wife tried to push me out of my own life. Knowing a little or knowing a lot, he had chosen, again and again, the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance had run directly over me and his mother. "You didn't know how much," I said quietly, "but you knew enough. You always knew enough, Daniel. You just decided it was easier not to look." He had no answer for that. There was no answer for that. What happened next happened quickly, the way these things do once the dam breaks. Arthur Quinn had already, on my instruction, and with the forensic report in hand, prepared everything. Within the hour, with Vanessa still sitting stunned in that conference room, the report was forwarded to the district attorney's office and to a fraud investigator with the state. Margaret had not just gathered the evidence. She had made sure, through Arthur, that the moment we were ready, the machinery of consequences was already loaded and waiting. Vanessa lawyered up, of course. She hired an expensive attorney from the city who made a great deal of noise about contesting the trust and challenging the forensic findings. None of it went anywhere. The trust was, as Arthur had promised, ironclad. Margaret had built it with the same care she built everything, and there was no crack in it for Vanessa's expensive lawyer to pry open. As for the embezzlement, the evidence was simply too complete. The forged signatures, the fake vendors, the cousin named Trent who had been collecting consulting fees for work no one could prove had ever been done, the metadata pointing back to her own laptop. It was, in the end, exactly what Arthur had called it. Airtight. Trent Walsh, the cousin, folded almost immediately when the investigators came to his door. He gave a statement implicating Vanessa fully in exchange for a lighter sentence, and just like that, Vanessa's last ally became the final nail in her case. She had spent years using people and then discarding them. She seemed genuinely shocked that someone would do the same to her. The charges against her were serious: felony, embezzlement, forgery, and fraud. Her expensive city lawyer eventually negotiated a plea to avoid the longest possible sentence, but the result was still a prison term, full restitution of the $410,000 she had stolen, and a felony record that would follow her for the rest of her life. The polished, beautiful woman who had counted my silverware with her eyes would spend years counting something else. Entirely, the recovered money went back where it belonged. I put every dollar of the recovered funds into the company's employee accounts because that money had been stolen from the business, and the business was the 60 people of the valley who showed up every morning to keep Margaret's orchard alive. They had earned it. Vanessa never had. As for my son, the divorce was filed before Vanessa's case even went to trial. She tried, from the wreckage of her life, to drag Daniel down with her, to claim he had been a full partner in the fraud. But Daniel, for once in his life, did the right thing. He cooperated fully with the investigators. He turned over every record he had. He testified to what he had signed and what he had been told. In the end, the investigators determined he had been a tool of the scheme rather than an architect of it, manipulated and kept in the dark about the scale of it. He was not charged, but charged and forgiven are two very different things. People ask me sometimes when I tell pieces of this story whether I took my son back in, whether the family healed, whether there was a tearful reconciliation and a return to the orchard and a happy ending where everyone learned their lesson and we all sat down to dinner together again. I will tell you the truth, because this channel has never been about comfortable lies. No, there was no reconciliation. Some bridges, once you burn them, stay burned. And some bridges you do not even have to burn yourself, because the other person already poured the gasoline and dropped the match while you were standing on the far side. Daniel came to the farmhouse a few months after it was all over. He stood on the porch where his mother used to keep her flower pots and he cried. And he told me he was sorry. And I believe that he was. I believe he meant every word. But I also remembered every morning I sat in my kitchen, pretending to be a broken old man, and I remembered the sound of his nervous little laugh in the hallway, when Vanessa showed him whatever she had typed on her phone 3 days after his mother's funeral. I told him I forgave him, and I meant that too. Carrying hatred is a heavy thing, and at 69 I have no interest in hauling it around. But I also told him that forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and that he could not have what he had thrown away. The orchard was not his. It would never be his. He had made his choices for 8 years, choosing comfort over courage, choosing his wife's approval over his own father's dignity. And a lifetime of small choices like that does not get undone by one good cry on a porch. He did not fight me on it. I think deep down he knew. He moved away, eventually, to the city. The last I heard, he was working an ordinary job and living an ordinary life. The comfortable cushion of family money gone, finally standing on his own 2 feet for the first time at the age of 41. I do not wish him ill. I hope he becomes the man his mother prayed he would be, but I am not waiting by the window for him. A man can love his son and still understand that some doors close for good. That is the hard truth at the centre of all of this. The people who circle a grieving family, the ones who smile at inheritance meetings, they are counting on one thing above all else. They are counting on your sentiment. They are counting on the fact that you are a good person who does not want to believe the worst, who will give one more chance, and one more after that, and one more after that, until there is nothing left to give. Margaret understood that. Margaret loved harder than anyone I ever knew, and she was also the most clear-eyed person I ever met. And she understood that protecting the people you love sometimes means refusing to be a fool for the people who would use you. I am still here at Hollow Creek Orchards. I am 70 now. I run the place with Earl Dawson, the foreman, who wept at Margaret's funeral, and the 60 good people of the valley who never once thought about taking anything that was not theirs. The cidery still ships to a dozen states. The cafe still fills with tourists every autumn. The trees Margaret and I planted with our own hands are old now, gnarled and heavy with fruit, and every spring they bloom white against the green hills, and I stand among them and I talk to her, and I swear sometimes the wind through the branches sounds like her laughing. I did one more thing, the spring after it all ended. I sat down with Arthur Quinn and I rewrote the trust one final time. The orchard will never again be a prize for someone to scheme over. When I am gone, Hollow Creek Orchards passes to the people who built it alongside us. Every full-time employee receives a share. The land is protected in perpetuity from being sold to developers, the way Vanessa always wanted. And the rest of what Margaret and I made, the savings, the investments, the value of a lifetime, goes into a fund in her name that sends the children of this valley to college. The ones with the ambition and the heart but not the money. The way Margaret and I never had the money, in that drafty farmhouse in 1981, with $200 in a coffee can and a baby on the way, and a dream nobody else could see. Margaret believed that what you build matters less than who you build it for. She believed that family is not the people who share your last name or marry into your fortune. Family is the people who show up in their good clothes to weep at your funeral. Family is loyalty. And loyalty, real loyalty, is the one thing in this world that cannot be forged, no matter how good you are with a pen. Vanessa smiled at that inheritance meeting, because she thought she had won. She thought she had cornered a tired old man with shaking hands and a broken heart. She never understood that the woman she had underestimated had spent 44 years teaching me one thing above all others. The quiet one is not always the weak one. Sometimes the quiet one is just waiting for you to show your whole hand. She showed me hers the day she sat in my dead wife's chair. And then Margaret, from beyond the grave, with one sealed letter and one recorded message, and one accountant's report showed her hours. I am Walter Cole. I built an orchard out of nothing with the love of my life. They thought grief had made me an easy mark. They were wrong. A man who has lost everything still has the one thing that matters most. He still knows exactly where he stands. And I was standing right where Margaret left me, in the orchard, with my teeth still sharp. Burned bridges stay burned, and I have never once regretted letting that one stay in ashes. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for staying with me. If you have ever had to stand your ground against someone who mistook your patience for weakness, tell me about it in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Because around here, we believe that loyalty is everything. And stay burned. I'll see you in the next one.